go to rounds of questions. Mr. Falconer, we're keen to hear what you have to say for the next 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Julian Falconer. I'm a human rights lawyer, and I've dedicated my 30-year career to advocating and writing on issues of racism in policing. I'm the founding partner of Falconer's LLP, a law firm with offices in Toronto, Thunder Bay, and Manitoulin. We have a long history of representing victims of police racism and violence in Ontario. I'm honored to attend before this standing committee on public safety and national security as part of your sessions on systemic racism and policing in Canada. Of course, the recognition of the existence of systemic racism in policing in Canada means little more than accepting that racism pervades all corners of Canadian society, and that it should hardly be a surprise that our policing institutions are no exception. As a bencher for the Law Society of Ontario, I'm embarrassed to admit that there remains many leaders in our profession, a significant number of my fellow benchers, to be honest, who continue to deny the existence of systemic racism in the legal profession. Obviously, there's no prospect of change if those in a position of power and privilege deny the existence of a problem. The very fact of the title of these committee meetings is a testament to how far we have come in terms of dialogue. And I want to start, and I understand the time constraints, so I want to be very quickly start with a bit of a caution, sound a cautionary note for a person who's in my business. I'm fortunate in the work that I do that far from only being exposed to bad policing, I have the honor of acting for a number of Indigenous police services in the province of Ontario. I believe fundamentally that policing has an essential role in our society as part of the social contract to keep all of us safe. Our police officers simply represent a microcosm of the entirety of society. They are our brothers, our sisters, our cousins. Like the rest of us, police officers have the right to be safe and go home to their families. This submission focuses on systemic racism and by necessity focuses on bad policing. Make no mistake about it, there is good policing, but our failures to effectively address bad policing overshadows and risks continuing to overshadow good policing. Now, the George Floyd tragedy in the US has given rise to an awakening in this country. The very fact that these committee sessions are dedicated to the topic of systemic racism in policing represents an important breakthrough in dialogue. While I feel it is incumbent on me to recognize this, I wish to state from the outset, dialogue's not enough. What plagues us is a lack of change, a lack of progress, an inability as agents of change to affect real new outcomes. We have an inability to actually have agents of change influence outcomes. My life's work has been legal advocacy in the battle against racism and social injustices in its many forms. At Falconer's LLP, our work spans 3 decades, and we've provided services to a diverse range of clientele whose differences span race, ethnicity, mental health, and culture. I'd like to think of myself and my team as agents of change. I've had the honor of working on cases such as the shooting deaths of Lester Donaldson, Wayne Williams, Edmund Yu, Sammy Ateem. I've represented the families of Ashley Smith. I acted for Meher Arar. Since 2008, I've had the honor of representing various levels of Indigenous governments, members of Indigenous communities, and Indigenous police services. In all this time, in all of these battles, I've learned that the famous and undeniable French expression, and you'll forgive me, je suis un petit gars de Mont-Saint-Hilaire, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose.
And I'm a little guy from Saint-Hilaire. The more things changes, the more it's the same. This saying applies.
Own steam in a small 4-seater plane that we like to call Falconer. As a lawyer and a bush pilot, much of my time is spent flying in the north. I've seen firsthand the highs and the lows of the battles against systemic racism. Its manifestations through the justice system as a whole, whether we are speaking about education, health, child welfare, or our justice system, are apparent and they remain unchanged. So while our ability to talk, the talk has started to occur, we far are from able to walk the walk. Even when the ugly truth of systemic racism is seen and agents of oppression are held accountable, there's no mechanism to enforce change. So I've seen this. I've seen this in Thunder Bay, when in 2018, the Office of the Independent Police Review Director made a historic finding through a report entitled Broken Trust, which I commend to you as committee members. That report, Broken Trust, made a finding that an entire police service suffered from systemic racism, that its incompetent investigations of Indigenous deaths was not just attributable to a lack of resources, to a lack of skills, but it was attributable to racism that pervaded every level of the service. In my career, the most damning finding in relation to a police service. Yet, here we sit in 2020, and I say this to you, nothing has changed. Now, why? Why is it that we seem unable to get out of our own way? I say that the reason is that we are unable to actually affect real change. Now, at page 3 of my submission, I'm well aware of the fact that I'm moving along in time. At page 3 of the submission, I point out that there is a way to start taking concrete action so that words translate into change. The first thing I want to point out is the concept of mobile crisis teams, the concept that police left on their own, rank and file police officers left on their own to de-escalate situations, doesn't work. People die unnecessarily. When you're somewhat of an old fart like myself, you're around for long enough, 3 decades. 28 years ago, in the inquest into the death of Lester Donaldson in 1992, we looked at the importance of having mobile crisis teams available. In 1994, and I attach and footnote these recommendations, they recommend the creation of a crisis intervention team with a 24-hour response time. It still doesn't exist in form of a 24-hour response time in Toronto. I say to you, and I've seen it repeatedly, Edmund Hughes, Sammy Yatim, I've seen it over and over again. We're seeing it right now in Toronto, in Mississauga with deaths. We are unable to implement and reallocate our resources so that de-escalation, wellness checks, all of the features of keeping people alive operate. And the reason is, I say, we put so much resources into a militaristic concept of policing, into creating an occupying force in communities. We are unable to wrap our minds around creating compassionate policing. And what does that mean? It's not some platitude. It means you take mental health professionals, you team them up with police officers interested in de-escalation, you create mobile crisis teams, and those teams aren't brought in only when the police, quote unquote, have the situation under control. They're brought in to de-escalate. Right now, the police culture is unable to wrap its mind around this. They believe that these teams should only be used after they, the experts, have brought the situation under control. It's a mistake.
Mr. Falconer, we're going to have to wrap it up. I'm sorry.
Certainly. It's an example of the kind of concrete steps I'm talking about. Second, and I want to emphasize this as well.
We're not going to have we're not going to have a second, unfortunately.
Sure. No problem.
I apologize, but the clock is just killing me.
No problem. If I can wrap up with this.
Okay.
That I think it's essential that we all consider and understand that without the work of the Auditor Generals to enforce these reports and these recommendations, this will all remain platitudes and empty apologies. If you want time for action, please read our submission and start taking concrete steps. Let's get past the words. Let's get into action. Thank you for your time.
Sorry again. Thank you. Madame Whitman, you and Mr. Pink, 7 minutes, please.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your words, Mr. Falconer. Good afternoon. My name is Lorraine Whitman, grandmother white sea turtle, and I would like to acknowledge the territory of Mi'kma'ki from where I am, of the Ilnu people. I am also the president of Native Women Association of Canada. I represent and I defend the rights of the First Nation, Métis, and Inuit women across Canada. You have asked me here today to talk to you about systemic racism in Canada's police force. This is an issue of highest priority for Indigenous women who fear that their daughters or sons could be injured or killed by the very officers who are sworn to protect them. This was what happened earlier this year when a young man reached out to the police in Edmundston, New Brunswick, because he was worried about Chantel Moore. I would say we all know what happened next, but in fact, We don't know what happened next. 2 months later, the investigation into Chantel Moore's death has yet to be completed, and her mother has yet to receive the autopsy report. All we know from the media is that Chantel, who was not armed with a gun, was shot 5 times by the police who were sent to her apartment to conduct a wellness check. How is it possible that a wellness check could end in a murder? These are sensitive issues, and I do not want to compromise the investigation by prejudice its conclusion. But I can tell you that we at NWEC have significant concerns about what's happened on the night Chantel was gunned down. And we have significant concerns in general about systemic racism in police forces across Canada and about the apparent lack of concern on the part of governments regarding the violence that is being directed at Indigenous women. I have met twice with Chantel's mother, Martha Martin. I can tell you she's devastated and wonders why the officer involved, who was not suspended when other suspensions have occurred in Edmundston police shootings. Was it because she was Indigenous? I join and support Chantel's mother in her demand for a public inquiry into this case. A simple coroner's investigation is not adequate. I have also met with Indigenous women who supported Martha since Chantel's death on June 4th. They're mortified, they're angry, and they're traumatized by the death of Chantel. But there have been many Chantels. There have been many cases in which our need to protect has been met with indifference or worse, yet brutality. I am not here to tell you that all police are racist, because they certainly aren't. As Indigenous women, we know all too well what it's meant to be painted with a single brush. But the brutality has got to end, and our members still face systemic racism in the dealings with police. These acts of violence and torture must be exposed and eliminated, and those who do it must be brought to justice. The rule of law means no one is above the law, and that we are all equal under the law. It appears clear that the rule of law, does not apply to Indigenous people in Canada. I spoke in July with Rcmp Police Commissioner Brenda Luckie. We have since sent her a list of recommendations that we hope will inform her review on the systemic racism within her force. To summarize the recommendations, we asked her for body cameras to be worn by all officers. We asked for more transparent oversight and investigation of serious incidents involving police and Indigenous people. We asked not only an Indigenous lens, but a gender-based lens be applied to Rcmp investigation protocols and procedures. We asked her to appoint an Indigenous woman as ombudsman person. We asked her to conduct with us on reconciliation strategies and to collaborate with Indigenous women's groups. We asked for an increase in restorative justice programs to keep Indigenous people out of the criminal justice system wherever possible. We asked for her work with Indigenous people when developing and delivering training to Rcmp officers. We asked for new de-escalation protocols that are developed with Indigenous people for Indigenous people. And we called for an enhancement of the collection of race-based data that would help expose the extent of the violation and the violence that is being committed against Indigenous women, girls, and gender-diverse people. But where the outrage is being expressed at the police killings of Indigenous people in this country, where are the protests over the deadly shootings of a beautiful young First Nations woman in Edmundston, New Brunswick, Why are the Indigenous people of Canada, the Indigenous people, left to fight this fight by themselves? The evidence of violence against Indigenous women by the police is clear and overwhelming. So my question for government and police forces is, this country is to do you finally hear us? Do you finally see us? Or do you continue to ignore and allow the violence to continue? I urge this committee to make it clear to the government and to purge the systemic racism from the police forces of Canada. Cannot wait for further deaths to occur and for other mothers like Martha Martin to be left with their grief and memory. Walalan, merci beaucoup.
Thank you, President Whitman. Colleagues, we are running way behind. I'm proposing that first round, I got it back from 6 minutes to 5 minutes, unfortunately. So with that, Madame Danko, welcome to the committee. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I just want to start off by saying thank you sincerely to the witnesses, Mr. Falconer and Mrs. Whitman, for your opening remarks. They're very, very powerful and very emotional. And I think all members of the committee can agree, we very much appreciated them. I have a number of questions for you, Mrs. Whitman. I hope we can fit them all in. Mrs. Whitman, I am the Shadow Minister for Diversity, Inclusion and Youth. My counterpart is Minister Chagger. Over a year ago, the Liberal government announced the Anti-Racism Secretariat with the mandate to help end systemic racism in our institutions and inform all government departments of how they can combat this, essentially. And so that was well over a year ago. We know that it's been in working order since at least June from the minister's remarks. Can you tell me, Mrs. Whitman, I mean, you represent the Native Women Association of Canada as their president. It is the most prominent advocacy group in Canada for Native women. Have you been contacted by the Anti-Racism Secretariat or Minister Chagger's office within the past year?
Not to the best of my knowledge, but we are still moving forward, with the systemic racism. We are trying to do the best that we can to be able to work with the violence that's occurring in our communities. Mm-hmm. And we know that systemic racism is there, and that's why we're supporting Chantel Moore's mother in using her, her death, which is very unfortunate because it was just a health check. Yeah. And how can this be? It escalated into 5 shots of a young Indigenous woman for a health check, and we need some changes, and we need them done now. That's why the national inquiry needed to be, to be given the day it was supposed to have been addressed by the ministers, and yet her death occurred the day after the anniversary of that.
And actually that leads in really well to my next question. On June 3rd, you had released a rather scathing report card of the Trudeau government regarding their response to the National Inquiry for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, which we know was released over 14 months ago. And my understanding is the Liberal government was supposed to release a strategy implementation plan, and they have not. And I have seen your comments in the news about, enough consultation, time for action. Can you just comment for the Liberal members of this committee and for all members of this committee, what do you want to see in this strategy plan if it ever does get released by the government?
Well, first of all, I want to be able to, have them to be able to correlate with us, to be able to include us at the tables when anything's being done. It's been told in the history that we've always been the problem. We know we've never been the problem. But you know what? We can be a solution to the problem. And without us being at the tables, being there to support our women, our girls, and our gender diverse and the communities, it's not going to change unless we're there. And we need dollars to be able to support. We have, our staff, we are short staffed in those areas, and it's impertinent that the dollars be able to be here as well, so that we can do an effective, efficient job for our women, our girls, and gender diverse, and Canada as a whole, because after all, we are all treaty people.
Very well said, Mrs. Whitman. Thank you for those remarks. I appreciate them. And I'm sure all members of the committee have heard them. And I hope that they're taken back to the ministers responsible for releasing the strategy from the Liberal government. My last question is about human trafficking. We know that this government has cut resources to several human trafficking facilities in Canada. I know that we see indications that Indigenous women and girls are more likely to fall victim of human trafficking. How can we better resource Indigenous communities to stop women and girls from being a victim of human trafficking? And how can we also better staff our police to get women out of this horrendous industry?
I'm not sure, when we look at the human trafficking, we have to look at where it's coming from. We look at our women as being very vulnerable. So do we put the emphasis on them? No, we need to be able to give them support. These are, we have these camps. And our women are taken, trafficking in these camps. We need to give our women resources, but we have to educate all of these, conglomerates, the mining fields, all of these areas so that they will be able to be also involved, because without them being involved, it's still going to continue. And I don't think we need to put that emphasis and that heartache on our women more, because these are the vulnerable ones, and it's up to us to be able to solve it for our women, our girls, and gender diverse.
Very well said. I agree. And I think all members of the committee would agree. We need more resources for these facilities to better support Indigenous women and girls. Thank you, Mrs. Whitman, for your candid remarks. Appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Dancho. Madam Nema, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both witnesses. You can hear the frustration in both of your voices in terms of this issue having been studied and recommendations having been made, and here we are sitting here in 2020 and we're looking at it again. I am hopeful. I do have a question specifically because we're looking at recommendations that we can give to the government around Indigenous policing. And as you know, First Nations policing is in the Minister's mandate letter to become an essential service. I feel it's beyond just giving funding to those police services, though. How can we equip them to actually be effective in their communities beyond just funding? And one concern I have is to provide trauma-informed services to Indigenous women in communities, and ensuring that we don't just replicate mistakes of other police services when we're empowering First Nations policing. How do we get more women in police services? How do we deal with women in small communities where their brother-in-law is the chief of police and they don't want to go because of domestic violence? Similar things that we do in other systems. So I'd like to put that question to both of you. As we look at making First Nations policing an essential service, how do we ensure that we're not repeating mistakes of the past and that we are providing essential services to these women in communities? So maybe Ms. Whitman, we could start with you, and then Mr. Falconer, if you wanted to add something, that would be great.
Okay, first of all, I think that, when you go into the communities, you need to look at the women organizations. I know at NWAC we have 13 PMAs. Those are president territorial members that are elected by the women in those provinces. So when we go as a national, I consider us as a motherboard, and those are our daughters below. If it's discussed with us, then we can reach out and be able to mobilize our women. We need to be part of the conversation. We need to know what the women and how they can mobilize to meet the needs of their women. Although, we know that violence is there. It may be different in each area. So we can't, again, generalize it all the way across the board. But we need to, again, educate. We need to be respectful of, our culture, our ceremonies, because this is what makes us who we are. We eat it, we drink it. So this is who we are. So we need that correspondence. We need that communication. But first of all, we need the respect. And I don't see the respect out there, and that respect goes a long way. And to be able to tell the truth and know that, yeah, we've made mistakes, but we need to correct these mistakes. And without admitting to that mistake, can we not move forward? We need to acknowledge that and let everyone be on the same level.
Mr. Falconer, did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, and I agree wholeheartedly with Ms. Whitman and commend her for her good work and really poignant comments. In acting for a number of Indigenous police services, including the largest in Canada, Anishinaabe-Aski Police Service, and the Indigenous Police Chiefs of Ontario, I've had a chance to look at these issues and reflect from my own perspective. I'm not Indigenous, and I don't pretend to speak for Indigenous people. I have to be very careful about that and respectful, but I will say this. The absence of legislative standards for Indigenous policing lies at the heart of all of this. Like health, like education, it's, we talk about making an essential service. Look, it's really simple. How come non-Indigenous people, primarily white folks, get their policing through legislation, but Indigenous people get it through programs? Well, the simple answer is once you go down that path, of course, bureaucrats decide your funding instead of the rule of law. Indigenous people are entitled to equity, and they are entitled to safety backed by the rule of law. And I just close with this observation. Indigenous policing, despite these limitations, is an area in which conventional policing can deeply learn. NAPS is a very good example. I know you've heard this, but in the 25-year history of Anishinaabe Police Service, no officer has ever taken someone's life with their gun. Now, how come that is? And that's the relationship with community that Indigenous police services enjoy. So while they're very resource-strapped, they've managed to keep that community relationship going. And I would only say it's fine to use the words essential service, but the real answer is, and they do it in child welfare. The federal government just did it. The real answer is respect there's provincial autonomy around legislation, but the federal government has an obligation to step in and fill the void for legislative enactment and legislative standards where they are not present in provinces.
Thank you. Unfortunately, you have 3 seconds left. I'm sorry, Pam. With that, Madame Michaud, 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Falconer, you just started talking about recommendations you would have about changing the way the police intervene. You talked about including people from the mental health sector and have them work with police. What exactly do you have in mind? First of all, I've never learned how to change interpretation. I hope my French is enough to let you know that I would like to.
Early of mental health professionals, but others, the program called COAST out of Hamilton, as an example, are made up of a combination. What's important about these mobile crisis teams, and this is where the notion of defunding policing actually, it's about allocation of resources. And what I'm trying to tell you is if you put the money into police officers who want to de-escalate, who want to do that for a living rather than use their gun or their taser, right? And there's nothing wrong with officers who joined up to use their toys. That's not unusual. But if you take police officers who have an interest in de-escalation, who have an interest in this area, and you team them up with mental health professionals, you'll get different results. There's an inquest into the death of Bo Baker. He's a Caucasian man with serious mental illness issues in the Waterloo area. We're just about to get that inquest off the ground. I simply ask you to pay attention because the issue the police are saying is we're not going to bring in the mobile crisis team until we've de-escalated the situation and it's safe. Well, of course, that's complete nonsense. The reason people are dying is that the police inability to de-escalate is part of the problem. So to answer your question, Ms. Michaud, I think it can take various forms, but it has to be people skilled in de-escalating.
Merci beaucoup. Et vous parliez aussi...
Thank you very much. You didn't have a chance to talk about reviewing responsibilities, that there should be sanctions when police officers misbehave. There should. What sort of a process do you have in mind? That's your second recommendation. Thank you for that question.
And this is what I believe. I mean, I was in Thunder Bay, literally by the park where the Floyd protests were happening, and I was struck by literally how many people came out. And I'm not trying to suggest that it's one solution, but what people have difficulty with, and it's become more and more obvious, is the double standard that is applied to bad policing. So what I see, whether it's the Thunder Bay Police investigation or the DeFonte Miller case, I have the honor of representing DeFonte and his family. He's the young black male beaten by the off-duty police officer and his brother, the Theriault brothers. 19,000 people logged in to watch the judge's decision in June, just last month. 19,000 people. Now, why would so many people be engaged? I'm telling you, they're engaged because they're troubled by our double standards. And the highest double standard is when police mislead about an event. And again, we're talking bad policing, not good policing. When police mislead about an event, they don't face obstruct justice charges as a rule. They don't face perjury charges. When they gild the lily, when they kind of fudge the facts to get past what they've done to someone, they don't face serious repercussions. We have to change that. If I lie under oath, I am charged with perjury. If you lie under oath, you're charged with perjury. That doesn't happen to police officers. We have to change that. And finally, the Auditor General piece. And I appreciate, Madame Michaud, you allowing me that opportunity to raise this. We could involve the Auditor General in auditing inquests and reports. Anishinaabe Nation asked the Auditor General in writing to monitor the implementation of the 7 youth inquest recommendations in Thunder Bay. The Auditor General refused. It has to matter to people. Ms. Whitman gets it bang on. Indigenous lives are treated less than worthy. And it comes out, and I see it in my work all the time, and it's disgusting. And truly, it's the part that troubles me. And if the Auditor Generals of this country, both the provincial and the federal, cared about Indigenous lives the way they care about bean counting, things would change. And I say to you, you could use them to monitor report implementation, to monitor inquest recommendations.
Okay, thank you very much, Madame Michaud. Mr. Harris, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both the witnesses for your presentations. I wish I had more than 5 minutes. First of all, Ms. Whitten, thank you for your exposition and your passionate concern about Chantal Moore and this very sad loss of her life, one amongst many, unfortunately. I've looked at, as many have, the report of your association, the report card on the implementation or lack thereof of the recommendations of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report. And you, under the right to justice, you talk about Indigenous women and girls being over-policed and over-incarcerated, as yet underprotected as victims of crime. And you've given the government a fail on implementing these recommendations. I think that's a shame, obviously, and I'm sure you do as well. I want to ask, what do you think this committee should do as a first step in making a recommendation? Obviously, transformative change has to happen, but it has to start somewhere. What should we do first in terms of recommending what needs to happen? You talked about truth, you talked about respect. We've got some recognition that there's a systemic racism in Canada and in policing, but what's the first step?
Your mute button, please.
Okay.
There you go.
First of all, you have to be able to meet with the women, at our national organization. We need to be able to be included at the table so that we can meet. We know the stories, we know the history. We eat it, we drink it, we walk it every day. And the truth, we have cultural components that go with it, which differs from some of the non-Indigenous. And we need to respect all of those. We have gone through so much trauma over the years with colonialism. We need to really look at the root of that colonialism, because when I look at it, I look at, government as a systemic discrimination and racism of its kind, because we're not all included. They say we're included. They talk. We're the most surveyed people around. I've met with Dr. Ian Zinger in the institutions, and he's talking about all of the women that are there. What treatment, even non-Indigenous women who have been incarcerated during this COVID were able to be released, but yet our Indigenous women were still there. They weren't able to be released like the non-Indigenous. So I'm wondering what's happening here. Why are we not as important? Because we still have the pain that we endure as any other woman that's incarcerated. And we need to be at those tables. We need to be respected. And yes, I do say the truth, because the truth needs to be known to all Canadians. And that's why that national inquiry had taken place. $92 million, 1,575 testimonies, 231 recommendations, calls for justice. The population, all of Canada needs to know. That's our history. And it is a book of history, and we need to be there, and we need to continue to educate. We may feel that education's out there, but we need to be able to continue and start zooming in on some very serious issues, this being racism.
Thank you very much, and I hope that we can do some justice to our mandate. Mr. Fantino, I don't have a lot of time, but I doubt
that it's Mr. Fantino.
Sorry, Mr. Falconer, I'm very sorry about that.
Minister Blair will tell you that Julian Fantino would be very uncomfortable with that slip.
Well, that's.
I think there's a mutual level of discomfort here.
A slip of the tongue, obviously.
Okay.
I actually saw his name when I was looking up yours, so it must have been the case which you had involving him, sir. The University of Carleton Department of Criminology department severing its ties with student placement programs at law enforcement agencies as a result of systemic racism. They said that police and prison institutions are hostile to outside critiques, show imperviousness to reform, and do not have the leadership capacity to engage in the transformative change that's required, says a statement from their Institute of Criminology and Criminal Justice. Is that a position with which you can agree? And is the state of things so bad that there is no hope for civilian oversight of police forces in Canada? We have over 200 of them, plus the RCMP. Is civilian oversight a working model in our system today?
Mr. Harris has a unique talent for asking questions right at the end of the 5-minute segment. Unfortunately, I'm leaving very little or no time for answering those questions. So maybe by some means or another, Mr. Falconer could come back on that. But with that, I'm going to move to Mr. Shipley, who is, unfortunately, colleagues, I'm going to have to cut this back to 3 minutes around. So, Mr. Shipley, 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, and thank you to all the witnesses for appearing today. Mrs. Whitman, this first one is for you. Are you satisfied with the current percentage of police women employed in the various First Nation services across this country and the RCMP as a whole?
I've got to look at the individual themselves. It's a career that they choose to go in. But at the same time, one has to recognize that it was the police force that came in and took our children out with the residential schools. With the 60 scoop, it was the police in uniform that took our children out. And it's been the fear of police. And even myself, I know from experience of my 4 older siblings being taken out of our home due to, the 60 scoop. So that fear's been there. And when people see that, they don't want to enter into something that's been so negative and so hurtful because they keep that in back. We have that back instilled in our memory, and it's hard for us to be able to come out. But I would hope that our younger generation would certainly look into any means to do with the law, and with the criminology, whether it be the police force or any of those areas in that avenue to move forward.
Well, thank you. And that leads into my next question too. What strategies could be easily and quickly put in place by the RCMP to recruit more members from First Nations communities into their service, and specifically women?
I think, first of all, you need that communication, that open door for communication. The RCMP has to be seen in a First Nation community as being an ally, not just coming in and, if there's a fight or a domestic or violence, being seen there, but coming in when there's things like, our Children on Bike Day, on, activities. I know in our communities in Mi'kmaq, the RCMP come when we have our family days. They're there with our bike rodeos for the children, and just to be there and seen and be valued, and just to say hi, because if they're seen more, then they're appreciated and respected more. But if they're only seen once in a while in the community, then there's some problems. And we don't always have problems. We have good things that happen on our First Nation communities, and we need to see you in a good light, because there are very good RCMP officers, and we have worked with many of them. But then again, there are the bad ones as well. But I think if we're seeing them out there, and that communication and conversations there, it makes a big impact on the welcoming of the RCMP into the communities, and for us to have a career in that area, especially for our youth.
Thank you, Mr. Shipley. With that, Mr. Ananzangri for 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the panel. And Mr. Falconer, I just want to put on the record the admiration I have for you and the work that you've done over the years. And it was a pleasure to work with you on issues around safe schools. I'm going to say about 15 years ago. And this question is really to both of you. There have been a number of different commissions of inquiries, a number of different incident responses that have taken place over the last 3 decades. Can you maybe outline specific recommendations relating to accountability that we can put within the police service? So I'm talking about a civilian oversight body and what elements would be important to put into a civilian oversight body.
If it's okay with Ms. Whitman, should I speak?
Please do.
Thank you. So listen, I've seen this committee's work specifically on the issues surrounding recommendations that have ended up in Bill C3 concerning the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission. What I am left wondering, after 30 years of doing this work in policing specifically, what is the fear of creating an independent oversight, civilian oversight over the RCMP? I mean, for God's sake, why is everybody, respectfully, why is everybody pussyfooting around this issue? You talk about adding some teeth to the work of the CRCC. That's fine. Obviously, Madame Lahaye is the real deal, as she tries to call them out because all she has is a recommendation function. But isn't the obvious going on here? You create an independent oversight body, a board that runs the RCMP. The same should be done with the OPP. So that's my first point. And then you make sure it's an effective oversight body. That doesn't exist. And so, honestly, the RCMP remains quite unbridled and quite a law unto themselves. And that's what Ms. Lahaye, the chair, has just recently announced. She cannot get them to follow her recommendations. And the reason is she doesn't run them. She makes recommendations. My second issue that I want to emphasize is that the role of Indigenous police services in this country needs to be A, legislated, and B, enhanced. Ms. Whitman, respectfully, shouldn't have to answer why and how the RCMP can adapt and change. Why doesn't all First Nations communities have the option of having Indigenous policing? You look at NAPS, you look at the Wakwamakwang Tribal Police Service, you look at the Treaty 3 Police Service, you look at the other police services in Ontario that are Indigenous. They make huge headway. I think it's an important step in the right direction.
Thank you, Mr. Ananzangri. Mr. Morrison, 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For Ms. Whitman, my question is, looking at some best practices, and we're looking at different policing models of what's going to, what's working and what isn't working, of course. I wonder if you can tell us if there's some best practices that you've seen that we should be employed nationally, and also should local communities be more involved in the hiring of police recruits?
Thank you for your questions. First of all, one of the best practice is inclusion of the communities, of the groups of people that are there. But also, I'm looking at the instance with Ms. Chantel Moore, what has happened with the wellness check. When we're dealing with some of our Indigenous people, we know the background. There should be a database in those communities, and understanding of elders, knowledge keepers that would know these people. We're all interrelated, no matter what province or territory we're from, whatever community. We have that heart, and we know that there's someone that they could call on to be able to help de-escalate de-escalate what had happened with Chantel Moore. So I do think there's a database that would be able to come and play with the elders and knowledge keepers of the local area, or a way or means that they would be able to pick up a call and ask for some help. You know, and when you're in a situation, if you have a mental illness and you have a terrible background, and you have someone banging at your door in a uniform, of course it's going to de-escalate. You know, how could it not? And anyone in their right mind, why would they go in by themselves without someone else there that would be able to de-escalate? And I realize that, you know, there may be other areas and concerns, but one needs to look at the other areas that would benefit the people as well as the officers involved. I mean, you know, it's a two-way mirror, and we need to work together and be able to put our heads together. And I really, truly believe if we do that, it would be a better society for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous.
Yeah, great questions, and you did touch on that earlier with your response to the police officers being involved in community events, and certainly, unfortunately, that isn't happening across Canada, and that is a critical part of being part of a community, not just responding to, for example, violent calls, and actually being there as a friend, not as somebody
Yes.
who's arresting someone. It's critical. I wonder, Mr. Falconer, if you can I've only got about a minute left. If you can just add on to...
No, you haven't. You've got about 15 seconds left.
Okay, just add on to a best practice that you would see employed across Canada.
And Mr. Falconer, if you could hold your microphone up closer to your
Sure.
mouth, translation's having some difficulties. Thank you.
The best practice that I would emphasize is the need to cease the emphasis on being an occupying force and reinforce the community perspective. Police services need to align their values with that of community, not the opposite. You see that in Indigenous policing. You need to set up Indigenous police services for success. The rest will happen. It will follow.
Thank you, Mr. Morrison. With that, we'll go to our final round of some combination of Madame Kerr and Mr. Sicken. I'm thinking that I would like to give a minute to Madame Michaud and Mr. Harris, particularly the last question for Mr. Harris, with which I unfortunately cut off Mr. Falconer. But so that's last 3 minutes, and then 1 minute to Madame Michaud and 1 minute to Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'll start with Mr. Falconer. Thank you for being here and for your testimony. You know, we've recently seen calls to defund the police, and you alluded to this earlier in your remarks and perhaps in one of the questions, understanding that does not equate to canceling the police, but rather reviewing their funding and how it's being used, while also ensuring that we're investing in mental health services, social services, and in communities. What is your recommendation on this narrative?
Well, this is precisely where you could involve the creation of true civilian oversight so that it's not the police making this decision. They are a paramilitary organization that is going to go in a paramilitary direction. The Paquette death in Toronto, Chief Saunders specifically said, I'm not going to send in the mobile crisis team when the situation is tricky. In fact, it's the opposite. We need them to do that. So you need civilian oversight to force these issues. Don't leave it up to the police. They're not going to change on their own.
Thank you, Mr. Falconer. Mr. Falconer, you know, we're talking about racism in policing, and but I also know in your career you've touched upon, you know, systemic racism elsewhere, namely co-authoring a report on its impact in the legal system. You made about 13 recommendations. What are some of those? And if you want to touch on some of those for this committee, that would be great. Thank you.
Well, you'll notice, and I'm honored, Ms. Kira, that you would have raised this. You'll notice that in my remarks, I comment that we're still challenged at the Law Society of Ontario. We still have benchers who literally deny the existence of systemic racism in the profession. What I would say is, in the end, right, those who are sort of in the business of denying reality will be left behind. The response in the following the Floyd death is proof positive that the majority of community want to see real change. So what I suggest is that you take your power and privilege that you as a committee have and you force the Auditor General, federally and provincially, to start enforcing these reports, because it's all there. And I don't mean, Ms. Kira, to get off topic, but you could make that change. You could make the change requiring the mobile crisis teams by the RCMP to be real and effective. You can make those changes. And so there's examples of concrete steps you could make. And finally, I do want to point out something that Mr. Harris's question about a university or a school not investing in conventional policing. Maybe they should look at Aboriginal police services. Maybe what they're not finding for their students in one place, they'll find in another.
Thank you.
You have about a minute.
Does any of my colleagues want to ask any of the witnesses a question?
I'll jump in there. So to Mr. Falconer, you were discussing how you envision more women in Indigenous communities policing themselves. You know, we already see that they have self-government. If you could just speak to that component that you started off on, please.
Yeah, in Ontario in particular right now, and I had the honor of being part of a team that on behalf of Anishinaabe Nation that negotiated with the provincial government over 100 amendments to the Police Services Act that haven't been proclaimed in force, but they've been passed by this Ford government, creating legislated police standards for Indigenous police services and an option to opt in to legislation. The reason I raise that is within these legislated standards are everything from appropriate crime units to emphasis on creating resources that are inclusive in nature. The community values mandate.
Just because we're short for time, I just want to emphasize. You mentioned an opting in mechanism for that.
That's right.
Yeah. Very briefly, you're not short from time, you're over time, but very briefly.
It's important that Indigenous communities choose for themselves. Not everyone wants the Queen's Act. Fair enough. There may be cultural identity protections in the legislation. I can tell you there are, but that they need to be able to opt in. And I'm saying create that options across the country. It's being done in child welfare. Bill C-92 is passed federally, even though there's provincial legislation. So I'm just trying to say this is an area where the federal government could step in and create federal standards legislatively.
Thank you, Mr. Second. With that, 1 minute to Madame Michaud and then 1 minute to Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for this additional minute. My question is for Ms. Whitman. During the last meetings, we talked about a national structural framework for police training. And we talked a lot about involving the communities in those trainings. So how should we reform those trainings to take into consideration the cultural reality, prevention of violence against women? How should we change training?
I think at our national office at NWAC, we do have the means that we are able to help assist, any of the officer and the police in training, as well as with our cultural component, because that's a very important component. And we do represent the Métis, the First Nation, and the Inuit. So we are able to call in elders, and the elders are so component to this whole scheme of, of change, because they know the history. We have the younger ones, so they have to blend with both. And I really do feel that if you're able to do change, then do it in a positive way and make sure that the people are at the table who are needed to be there and to be able to make use of, of the women and the community and the elders, so that we're all inclusive and there's not one that's left out.
Merci, Madame Michaud. Mr.
Thank you, Ms. Michaud.
Please.
Thank you, Mr. Falconer, for dealing with my addressing my questions and other answers. I have another one, which is about the what do you think of the possibility and how could we create enforceable standards on use of force? mandating deregulation, outlawing racial profiling and things of that nature, ensuring that these are enforceable across the country, and making it the standard that every police force has to follow to avoid the kinds of situations that we're seeing now.
So I would say, Mr. Harris, first and foremost, you're entitled to legislate federally in terms, obviously, of the RCMP. So I start with the RCMP and the reality that you can, just as right now, there are mandatory training requirements for use of force, for training around firearms, tasers, etc. You could create the same level of robust, rigorous requirements for training around de-escalation and for highlighting and showcasing those with those skills. Every rank and file officer is not going to be able to do this. I think that's totally unrealistic. What you need to do is showcase and feature why being an expert in de-escalation advances you in a police service and puts you in a place, potentially working with mental health professionals or others, that allows you to save lives. My real point is you can create training standards for the RCMP that can become the showcase for other police services, and that's where to start. I do think, and I insist, your complaints commissioner doesn't have enough powers. She's a watchdog. You need someone that runs the service, not government.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there, Mr. Harris. I apologize. I apologize for the tyranny of time. It is what it is, but all of us operate with that. Your insights and your candor, and we will certainly incorporate much of what you've had to say into our report. So with that, colleagues, I'm adjourning the meeting, and look forward to doing this again this time next week.
Mr. Chair, may I just briefly ask that the 2 documents we provided be part of the proceedings, if that's okay?
By all means.
Thank you. Those are the 2 documents that we provided. Thank you.
Thank
I thank
you.
the committee.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you
Take
both
care,
for
folks.
witnesses.
Be safe.
Bye.